I'm delighted to say that our first speaker today, who was, I think, our first speaker a year ago, is Keith Parks from Visions 3. And I'm delighted that Keith's focus is going to be on the way that we are evolving in our practice and how rich and energetic the doing side of our business has now become. So can you please join me, please, in welcoming Keith Parks for this first session. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy. When I was 12, I got a little monocular microscope as a present. The optics were just about good enough quality that if I angled the little mirror just right and shone the little light in, I could actually get a pretty good image through this. And it was fantastic seeing the detail that this gave and being able to see things that as yet I had not seen. 2 years later, my dad brought back a 120-year-old Victorian brass Ross microscope from work. This was a binocular microscope, so 2 eyepieces, and you were viewing it in 3D. And I was mesmerized. This gave a completely different feel to the world that you could see down this. The interaction between the organisms that you were looking at, the objects you were looking at. We scooped up a dish of pond water, put it in a Petri dish and put it underneath, and it gave a completely different sense to what was going on. About 10 years later, I was installing a 3D exhibit into Wildscreen at Bristol, and there was a still image, a picture of a tree frog sitting amongst leaves with raindrops on the leaves. And I stopped and looked at the visitors coming through after I'd put it in, and there was a young kid who put his nose to it, looked at this, and was looking at the static image for about 4 minutes. This would be an image that normally a kid or an adult would look at for maybe 3 seconds, 5 seconds, but the power of 3D to convey a considerable amount more information was really clear here. In later years, more recently, we were doing a test for a feature, and one of the shots was a close-up on the main character rooted to the spot in fear, and the shot lingered on him, and we saw the fear come across his face and change as he was looking at the object of his fear. And you could hold that camera position, you could hold that view, that shot, for so much longer than you would ever consider in 2D, and it was mesmerizing. You got a completely different feel of intimacy than you would have done in 2D. And it is this feel, this wonder, this ability to do things that 2D can't do, that I think we're just on the cusp of starting to see. The talk today, I want to talk about features, where we've come from, what we can learn from the features of the past 2 or 3 years, and also look a bit behind some of the headlines and the sound bites and the assumptions of what's gone on. You know, have some of the films that have been heralded as good really been good? Have some of the ones that have been bad really been bad or detrimental to the industry? Just get this working. So, the difference between new and good. I would suggest that up until this point, and remember I'm talking particularly about features, but the emphasis has been on the new. A lot of films have made it out there, have been made and made in 3D because it's new, because audiences would go and see it. There was an expectation of greater box office return. But I think we're now at a point, and I'll go into this a bit more later, where we really need to start concentrating on what's good, how we can make this good, how we can make this 3D experience add more to the film. Let me just get this working. Here we go. Okay. A lot of you will have seen this curve before. It's the Gartner hype cycle. It's a visual representation of new technologies and how they evolve and the transformation they go through. Initially, you have the technology trigger, usually hyped or commented on by the press. This creates an expectation, and you get inflated expectations that drive the initial interest in and investment into the technology or the product. Following that, there's what's called the trough of disillusionment. It's where people start to question whether it actually can provide what it's set out to provide, whether it can fulfill the hype set out by the press. And following on from that, people start to use the technology or the product or develop new iterations of it, second and third generations, that start to use the technology in a way that really shows its benefit. And finally, you get the plateau of productivity where companies, the technology is well understood and companies start using it and developing it and taking it further. I think we can, in the case of 3D, the technology trigger can be seen in two forms. One, the development of the digital technology and the theatres investing in digital. But in terms of films, you've got Avatar around here. The realization that 3D can be used as a serious storytelling tool, and obviously the box office that came from that, and the investment into new features in 3D and the expectation of that greater box office. On the way up, you had some of the Coralines, the ups, some of the features that in many ways made pretty good use of the 3D. At the peak, well, I think that will come back. At the peak, you have the likes of Clash of the Titans, Pirates of the Caribbean, which in some ways have compromised people's expectations of what 3D can do. I'll come on to some of the positive aspects of those films later, but in terms of audience perception, some of those films at that time made people question whether 3D could actually give something of benefit. You then come into the trough of disillusionment, where people have decided, okay, this new technology hasn't got anything to offer. I think this is about where we are now. I think we are just starting to be kicked out of the bottom here. I think features like Hugo, which actually question things and do things a bit differently, which I'll come on to in more detail later on, are starting to help push us out of this trough. And then you're out onto the slope of enlightenment, which I think will feature a lot of the films coming out this year. 3D has undoubtedly been going through its growing pains with the success of Avatar. It's been seen as a bit of a cash cow, and this has driven a lot of the films. Some films have been made that arguably shouldn't have done, using the 3D to plaster over some of the cracks in what actually wasn't necessarily a particularly good 2D film in the first place. Some TV has been made on the basis that it is 3D, that would never have happened had it just been in 2D. And I think this is starting to change. Audiences are starting to see the difference between good and bad 3D, and they're starting to hunt out the bad and hunt out the good and ignore the bad. Studios are realizing that actually they can't use 3D to cover up a mediocre 2D product. And most importantly, directors are starting to see what they can use this technology for. It's very easy to be critical of a lot of the productions that have come through, but even those that we question and that haven't been received well have contributed something to this move forward. It's arguable that whether the 3D version of Harry Potter offered anything more in 3D than it did in 2D, but it did a considerable amount in terms of developing the workflows and pushing things forward that that have helped some of the features that will be coming out over the next 6 months. The likes of Transformers had a huge benefit on people's realization of the projection side of this equation, the fact that theaters are projecting these 3D films dim. It's often not the fault of the films that the experience is less than good. It's often the projection technology, the dimmer bulbs, the turning of the power down of the bulbs so that the life of the projectors and the bulbs is extended. But a huge amount is happening on that now. Brighter bulbs, new technology from companies such as RealD, and laser projection, which promises to be a lot brighter. Films like The Hobbit and Avatar 2, irrespective of what promise to be fantastic or very interesting films, the introduction of 48 frame per second technology will add a whole new level to the clarity and what 3D is able to provide. And even films such as Clash of the Titans, it's almost become a shorthand for bad post-conversion or bad 3D. But actually what Clash achieved technically in a short period, 6 weeks, was phenomenal. The results arguably did more harm than good, but what they achieved was amazing. And again, it's helped to drive forward the quality and better quality post-conversions that have happened since. And you heard Matt Bristow from Prime Focus talking about some of what they're doing. And there's a whole new approaches to post-conversion, which pay a lot more attention to the 3D space, where they're actually remodeling the entire scenes, and rather than just rotoscoping individual objects and giving them a bit of an offset to give the 3D and then introducing volume into those, they're actually remodeling the whole scenes in the computer, reprojecting what's been shot in 2D onto those. You're still not getting what you started out with. There's still an artistic interpretation, but again, it's giving us something different. John Carter was an example of this. I would also like to say that in my comments on features today, any criticisms are from the point of view of learning and looking at moving forward. These aren't criticisms of the decisions that were made or the people taking the decisions. On any feature, there are thousands upon thousands of decisions that need to be made, and almost as many compromises. Even on a $200 million feature, there is never enough time or money, and compromises to the 3D, decisions are made that compromise the 3D knowingly, but knowing that not making those compromises would compromise something else further. It might mean the film can't be made, that there isn't the budget, scenes can't be filmed, VFX sequences can't be costed, and things that prevent the story from being as good. So a lot of the decisions that are taken are very much with that in mind. In the current resurgence of 3D, particularly heralded by the arrival of Avatar, the mantra has been for subtle 3D. Jim Cameron talked about this 3D behind the screen plane, immersive 3D, talking about keeping it subtle. This is the new classy 3D of the current resurgence. It's a move away from the gimmicky 3D. There's some truth to that, but there's been a fear of using 3D intelligently, and Avatar's success has become 3D's ball and chain in some ways. There's been this mantra that too much depth equals bad, but I mean that is true, but how much depth is bad? Pina is one of the few films that's actually set out to use 3D in a way that made sense. It has done what it felt was right. The German director, Wim Wenders, and his French stereographer set out to make a film with very much an artistic goal in mind. They didn't make the film until 3D became available because they felt that 2D didn't give them the storytelling tools, the experience that audiences, that would help audiences appreciate what was being shown. Yeah. Okay. That stereographer, that Frenchman, was Alain Dérobe, who unfortunately died 10 days ago, he was somebody who more than anybody really had an understanding of how this tool could be used and how it could be used creatively. And his presence will definitely be missed. But what they achieved in Pinot was something different and something that really hasn't been matched to the same extent since. So why has a lot of the 3D of the last 3 years been what I would call flat? Some of it's been why bother 3D? It really hasn't added anything to the production. If you've heard Phil Strather talking here, you will have heard him talking about making use of negative space, making use of theatre space. He talks about the bulge, where elements of the scene are brought into the theatre space. This is definitely true when Jim Cameron's talking about keeping the scene behind the stereo window, and productions that followed taking that more literally than probably even he intended. That is reducing the amount of space that you have available. And Phil Strather is talking about trying to break that down. And that is essential. But that is only part of the story. Let me just catch up on this. It is actually the volume of the subjects, the volume of the scene, the volume of the people in front of the camera that gives 3D the intimacy that I think often is missing. It's the volume that gives back that experience that I experienced as a 14-year-old boy, or looking at the kid looking at the tree frog, or the shot of the close-up of the guy experiencing fear. The volume that you can bring to characters is what introduces that intimacy, and it is what helps the actors to communicate. It's the difference between space between objects and volume within the objects themselves. And by introducing space into the scene, you are introducing volume into the scenes, but there's been a fear of true stereoscopic roundness. And it's this roundness, this detail, this ability to see people as you would expect to see them in real life when you're having that conversation and experiencing the non-verbal communication. It's this that really gives that intimacy of experience. I usually reckon that it takes a couple of months of working with directors and DPs if they haven't experienced 3D before they really understand how 3D can be used and some of the subtleties of it, and how they understand how it can contribute to their production. I will nearly always start my conversations with directors by showing the material, looking at how they might want to use 3D on their film. I will show them examples of characters, actors with stereoscopic roundness, and they will nearly always find this unattractive. They will nearly always want to go for the flatter the 3D, the more subtle 3D. I thought this was something that was unique to live action 3D, but talking to Phil McNally, the head stereographer from DreamWorks, stereographer in things like Puss in Boots and Shrek Goes Forth and Megamind, he experiences exactly the same thing, this reluctance of directors to actually introduce this volume. This is even more the case with DPs, and while working on Jack the Giant Killer recently, the DP on that was Tom Siegel. He was the DP on Drive, which also came out recently, and films like X-Men and The Usual Suspects. And we talked multiple times about this. It was a question that kept coming up. He was interested about what he was missing or what he was seeing, and the fact that my thinking was sometimes differing. And we put it down to the fact that DPs, particularly directors as well, spend their whole lives when they're working with 2D trying to create depth within their scenes. Within 2D films aren't flat. They have depth within them. There's perspective and there's parallax cues, and focus is used extensively and lighting is used extensively. And when I'm coming along and introducing this new depth, this roundness, it feels fake to their understanding of how depth can look and everything that they've worked towards over their 2-year career in this medium. And almost the more experience they have and the more skilled they are at creating depth in the scene, the harder it can be to accept the stereoscopic roundness. This is a quote from a stereo supervisor on many of the big features out there. Some directors and DPs do not like the look of real humans with what most of us would refer to as stereoscopic roundness. As a stereographer, we are limited by the lens composition and aesthetic choices of the director and DP. We can guide them to water, but we cannot make them drink. What he says is absolutely true. Directors do find it difficult to accept this stereoscopic roundness, but the second part of what he says, I would fundamentally disagree with. It is our responsibility as stereographers, as stereo supervisors, as people who work with 3D, to help to explain and break down some of these preconceptions in the way that this new medium can be used. Absolutely, it's not our job to go against the director's will or do something that isn't consistent with the story that he's trying to tell, but it is our responsibility to help them tell the story and use 3D to tell that story in a consistent way. You can see this tendency to avoid volume in a multitude of productions. Harry Potter, I've already mentioned, the conversion of Star Wars, films like Pirates of the Caribbean. Very gentle 3D, and people assume that this is, in the case of post-conversion, it's a result of the post-conversion, or it's a result of late decisions to go 3D. But a lot of the time, it is directors who are actually choosing to go for this gentle 3D. There's been a fear of the gimmick, and this has prevented films from actually giving audiences an experience in 3D that makes use of this stereoscopic roundness, this volume, this sense of intimacy that you can get. It's also easier to post-convert if you introduce relatively little depth. It's easier to shoot if you're introducing less depth. And you're less likely to be accused of gimmick. You're less likely to introduce distortion that gives a feeling of that pulls audiences out of the scene. You're less likely to make it uncomfortable to view. I call this the cliff of distortion. This graph gives an idea of the sort of decision-making and the benefit of 3D and how that evolves with the amount of depth you put in there. Starting here, you've got a 2D image, a zero interaxial, no separation between your cameras. Your image is flat. As you increase, you start to introduce more volume to this. The image becomes a bit more interesting from a 3D point of view. You start to see separation, start to see a bit of volume in characters and objects. As you come up to this end, you start to get towards this stereoscopic roundness, this volume that audiences relate to and that gives a satisfying experience. But you reach a point, at the ultimate point of 3D, where you're getting that most satisfying experience, where if you take it a touch too far, that's when you start to introduce distortion. It's when faces start to become ugly, distorted, not looking right. You're more focused on the 3D than you are on the character or what's being said, and you make it harder for audiences to view. And it's this cliff, this fall-off, the fact that it's difficult working around here. It's risky. Most films end up working in this area here because there's a reduction of risk. You can work without so much concern for the 3D or how it's going to affect the edit or how you're trying to use it across the film. If we're talking about 3D and how it can be used to help tell a story, then I would argue that the majority of the films that have used 3D out there at the moment, and out there particularly over the last year, have been the wrong kind of film. I'm not saying that these films shouldn't use 3D or that the 3D doesn't bring benefit, but if critics are looking and audiences are looking at what 3D has to contribute, these aren't the films that will bring the real benefit. Roger Ebert says, 3D is unsuitable for grown-up films of any seriousness. It limits the freedom of directors to make films as they choose. For moviegoers in the PG-13 and R ranges, so the adult films, the films for people over 12, it only rarely provides an experience worth paying a premium for. And I would argue this is because there really hasn't been the sort of film that will benefit from 3D. There's been a tendency for everyone to think of 3D as being something that contributes to action films. It makes VFX more spectacular. It makes the action more actiony. We did a film, TT 3D, a couple of years ago, and it was in the initial stages, whenever we were talking about this film, the reaction of people was, oh yeah, fast bikes, fantastic in 3D. That isn't what really gets the benefit from the 3D. Fast bikes on film look fantastic anyway, and yes, you can add a little bit to the wow factor and the feeling, the speed, but the things that really work, the things that really communicate that story are the shots of these guys who are risking their lives, putting their lives on the line every time they go on the track. And you're seeing their expressions and their reactions and their feelings, and these are being communicated better by the 3D. We really haven't seen any of these films recently. Hugo's just started to push that barrier bit, and I'll come on to that in a minute. But I think over the next year, this is going to change. Transformers almost was the antithesis of this. Fantastic spectacle. The 3D definitely added to that spectacle, but Michael Bay actually said that they used 2D for the close-ups of people and then looked to post-convert it. These shots, which I believe, and I think we'll see, and I think Hugo has started to prove, actually add the benefit to 3D. These are the ones that on some of the big films have actually been disregarded as adding anything to the 3D. We're working on a film at the moment where there is a single shot that lasts several minutes focused on one character. The director is finding that he can hold the shots longer on the actors and actresses and can really use the 3D to keep your attention focused and to communicate more with the audience. And there are more of those coming over the next year. This is where we will really start to see the 3D contributing in a way that goes back to the shots of the tree frog, this character mesmerized. It's the 3D that can really communicate. One film that has used 3D differently to the conventional wisdom is Hugo. It's been the first of its kind, I would say, that's really used 3D in this way. If I was being harsh, I would probably say that a lot of the success, a lot of the attention has been because it's been new rather than because it's necessarily been good. A lot of the 3D on Hugo was good. There was great attention to the set design. There was fantastic detail in the designs of the scenes and the intricacy and the texture, which the 3D loved. Scorsese, as he started learning about how 3D could be used, actually changed the design of sets to better play towards the 3D. This is certainly not something that's happened on films before. And it really wasn't afraid to use volume. The stereoscopic roundness that I'm talking about, Hugo started to use some of this. But there was a lot that had grown out of Robert Richardson's and Martin Scorsese's 2D background. The over-the-shoulders, the soft-focus foreground to try and maintain an element of depth, the long lenses, a lot of these things that actually worked against some of these other things that they were trying to achieve. They stayed wider and they stayed sharper in the foreground, and they avoided some of these things, but there were a number of scenes, a lot of scenes, where actually what they were trying to achieve was compromised by some of the 2D language. And of course, this film had to go out in 2D as well, so they couldn't purely think about the 3D, but there was a lot that was done that was good and set a new mark. The one thing that I really don't think it fully achieved, it started to achieve it, and there were some interesting things made, is using 3D to add to the storytelling. And I know I'm in the minority here, and a lot of people have written about how Hugo really contributed to the story. The 3D onto Hugo really contributed to the storytelling. Often they'll talk about the shot of the Doberman where the distorted 3D helps that feeling of the Doberman thrusting its nose out towards the audience, towards the kid as he's trying to escape. But the same technique was used in shots where it didn't insist the narrative, and the narrative was actually about something very different. And this is where I would find my main criticism with Hugo, for all that was good about it, and certainly not trying to take away from what it did achieve, but it's that consistency. A lot of 3D is actually about, and where we've got to move it now, it's about how 3D works from shot to shot and scene to scene and across the movie as a whole. It's not about making individual shots work on their own. The sort of 3D that Hugo used would be like shooting in 2D and doing your first shot, and because there were nice colors in the scene, when you graded it, you bring out the saturation in those colors and give it a real punch, and then you come around for the reverse, and you're trying to pull the details out of the shadows, so you grade it flat and lower contrast. These two shots on their own will look gorgeous individually, but cut them together and they will look like different places and will communicate something very different to the audience. Most of my time on productions is actually spent not on working with individual shots, it's in trying to shape the 3D across the film and give it a consistency. It's working with the designers to ensure that the design of the sets is going to help us achieve the 3D that we've decided will make sense at that part in the story. It's working with the director to ensure that the lighting allows us to do what we're trying to do and use the 3D in the way that we'd intended. An example from Jack the Giant Killer, and actually an example from most films, an over-the-shoulder dialogue shot. So you're shooting a two-hander. The first shot was of Ian McShane talking to his daughter, Eleanor Tomlinson. Eleanor Tomlinson's the princess. We've got her in the foreground. We're looking past her to Ian McShane looking towards us behind. The princess was slim and could easily be contained within the frame, and my stereo AC, Gavin, set the shot up beautifully. It worked lovely. Eleanor was out in theatre space. She was part of the audience. We were looking past her to her dad behind, the king, as he was talking to her. But we realized that when we came around for the reverse of this, we would have to treat it completely differently. Ian McShane was wearing a big robe, wide shoulders, and he was going to fill the whole width of the frame. And he had a white mink collar, which was going to be soft focus and bright in the foreground. And if we tried to hold the stereo the same as we'd done on the over of Eleanor, we were going to make the cathedral look a different volume from the two sides. The shot over Eleanor's shoulder would make it look like the cathedral had great depth, and then when we came around over Ian McShane, suddenly it would look shallow and flattened off, and it would have a different feel to it. What we actually ended up doing was making that first shot less dramatic in terms of 3D, but so it worked better with the reverse. And we actually changed the speed of the push-in onto Ian McShane so that the foreground wasn't so soft by the end of the push-in, and we angled his shoulders slightly so that his shoulder was able to come out slightly into theatre space to increase that intimacy. There is a lot of talk at the moment about the death of this new 3D fad. Since Avatar, productions have found it necessary. They've been remiss if they haven't considered 3D as part of the equation. But I think now we're finally at a point where productions are going 3D because directors are pushing it. We're certainly seeing this change. A lot of the studio productions, it is the directors who are pushing it. They're having the say as to whether it's post-converted or going native. They're having the say whether it's going 2D or 3D. And those conversations are starting to happen where we start to look at how 3D can be used. Over the course of this year, we will see films released by directors such as Ang Lee, Baz Luhrmann, Peter Jackson, Ridley Scott, Alfonso Cuarón. 3 of those films are going against the usual 3D type of film. These are films that are using 3D in an entirely different way. They're using 3D to help communicate, helping the actors to communicate to the audience. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see how those develop. I'd like to finish up by saying that here in the UK, we have a different way of approaching 3D to a lot of what's happening on the other side of the Atlantic. A lot of the 3D that's been happening has been driven by the technology. Over here, it's starting to be driven, or has typically been driven much more by the creative and the content. We've got the likes of Sky who have shown a support and a consistency to their 3D that has allowed productions to factor them in, have those conversations, and Sky are driving better quality 3D, more intelligent 3D. John Cassie yesterday was talking about how they're not just looking for the expensive flagship productions. If people have ideas, if production companies have intelligent ideas that use 3D well, then those are equally valid and they'll pay as much attention. We've got the likes of ARRI and Panavision and Take-Two and OnSite, who have put huge amounts of resource into developing the hardware and the technology, building on what's commercially available and making these rigs, this equipment, the lenses, the optics, the grip, more workable and more usable in a typical production. And you've got the individuals out there, the technicians and the artists who are seeing 3D as an extension to 2D in terms of they're taking their skills from 2D, they're looking at what they were trying to create in 2D, looking at how this can be adapted and changed and moved forward for 3D. And whether it's a $200 million feature production or a $3 million production feature, whether it's a 30-second commercial or an hour-long documentary, I genuinely believe that in this country, with the people doing what they're doing, we can offer arguably more than anywhere else in the world. But what it does require, and it's something that John referred to yesterday as well, is it requires people working together. It requires the best of those skills being brought together. There's no way that, for example, us as a company can hope to support hardware, give the service, have the backup in terms of rigs and lenses and optics that a Panavision or an ARRI can hope to. We can concentrate on the creative and the content and designing intelligent 3D, but we need to work with those people. Likewise, on the post-production, somebody like OnSite has more experience of creating 3D than almost anyone in the world. And it's using the best of what's available in this country that's really going to help drive things forward. And I think the next next year is going to start showing some very interesting things. So I'm going to finish there, but would like to take questions from anybody who might have some.
Can we get the microphone, please?
Hello, thank you. I was just wondering how you find the balance if you're shooting a film, and obviously there will be 2D versions of it made as well as the 3D version. How do you find that balance? You know what you're saying about Hugo, and some of the shots were obviously designed more for 2D. But how do you approach your projects overall when you know ultimately you're doing it for 3D, but you know they're going to be 2D versions as well?
That is always a consideration, this how much attention do we pay to 2D and how do we plan things so it will work for both 2D and 3D. I mean, actually, on more and more productions, we're starting to see different edits for the 2D or different emphasis on the two versions. Even when we're not, it often ends up being a compromise, but if you're intelligent about it and how you do it and you ensure that the scene has enough for the people who are viewing it in 2D at the same time as giving enough of what you need for the 3D, it is possible to work the two together. Normally on 3D productions, it'll depend on the director. If the director is really trying to use 3D for something to help tell the story, then he'll start thinking about 2D as a secondary consideration. And we're seeing more and more of that as we see directors wanting to use 3D. The primary focus of the film will be on the 3D and how that can be used. So it is a consideration, but it's less so than it has been in the past.
Time for one more question, I think. If there's one, quick one, please. No hand oh, yes, just to...
Hi, Chris. Do you feel that a higher resolution or a higher frame rates will do anything to increase or improve the evolution of stereo?
I think the higher frame rate work that's being done, particularly what's happening with Avatar and Avatar 2 and Hobbit at the moment, is going to make a massive difference to the experience of the 3D. One of the biggest constraints when we're shooting is strobing. It's the breakdown of the 3D image as we move the camera. And this has always been a consideration. It always constrain slightly what you're doing, and it certainly has an effect on action sequences. And the move to 48 frames, while we're only doubling the frame rate, we're getting much closer to the point where strobing ceases to be an issue altogether. They reckon that if you take it to 60 frames, you're at that point where you really won't perceive strobing and the individual images or the flicker. And 48 frames is pretty close to that, and it's not just twice as good as 24 frames. 48 frames is considerably more and gives a completely different experience. Again, what it will rely on is projectors upgrading their firmware or their systems to take it. But yeah, it will make a considerable difference, and much more so than resolution. Resolution will help, but the frame rate will have a much bigger effect.
Chris, thank you very much for starting off the second day of this conference and giving us so much food for thought, but also thinking back as well as forward and where we might go. I hope you're going to be available to come to what I hope will be the next conference. But for now, thank you very, very much.